Welcome to the season 5 premiere of the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. This is the podcast where we dissect and analyze the epic, the cool, the amazing power of storytelling and learn how to harness that power in our everyday lives. I'm Gorev.
And I'm Kevin.
Kevin, season 5. How does it feel?
Whew. It feels different. It feels new. We are recording in person together to kick off a new season. We have some great extra storytellers lined up already. So super excited to bring all those to all of you who are listening or watching.
Yes, or watching. That's the operative word. I mean, I think for our 5th season, we're doing something new. We are recording video for the 4 episodes. And so we're going to be playing around with a lot of cool stuff this season. So playing around with different mics, playing out with the background here, figuring out if there's too many echoes. And there's a lot of stuff we have to figure out. But I think something we learned from doing this podcast is that sometimes you just need to start. This intro is actually different than the intro that came out on Spotify. And that's something else we're going to do. We're going to try to do different things for the video and the audio podcast. The core conversation will always be the same, but we're going to try some stuff with the top hat and the intro so that we're not just recording an audio podcast and uploading it on YouTube. We're trying to elevate our storytelling. If we're going to have a video, let's be intentional about it. Let's find ways to connect with our audience a little bit more. But this is exciting because we're innovating with the show. We get to ask ourselves, how does video enhance our storytelling? And Kev, we were very intentional. I hated video podcasts when this show started. Yep. This is 5 years ago when they first started. And I was like, podcasts have to be in your ear. And I think over time, as we tried new things, like we did our 50th recording video, I started seeing some of the cool elements you can include and ask ourselves, okay, how can we elevate our storytelling and be intentional when including video? So if you go to our YouTube right now, you can listen to all of our past episodes. They have just been uploaded to YouTube. Definitely go follow, subscribe. So welcome to season 5.
To kick off season 5 of LSPT Pod, we have someone truly amazing. And it's going to be a very meta conversation as well, because we're going to talk about talking. The action of talking itself, a very basic human need. Obviously, with podcasting, there's a whole bunch of talking as well. That is the very act we are doing between us and our expert storytellers. But we are talking to Alison Wood Brooks, who teaches a fantastic MBA class at Harvard Business School about talking as well. And Alison is coming out with a new book called T.A.L.K, and is actually an acronym as well. The 4 key principles to approaching a conversation better. T for topics, A for asking, L for levity, K for kindness. We're going to get into each of those 4 letters with Alison, expose ourselves as well to talk about some of the vulnerabilities or struggles we have when approaching any kind of conversation. There's so many great storytelling insights and cool stories that Alison's sharing with us in this conversation. So without further ado, let's dive right in and start off our season 5.
Linen suit and plastic tie. Now here's Gorev and Kevin.
Alison Wood Brooks, welcome to the show. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What is your story?
Oh my gosh, what a terrifyingly open-ended question there, Kevin.
Exactly.
I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for having me. I am a professor at the Harvard Business School, where I have been doing behavioral science. I'm a scientist and studying people. I've been at HBS for 12 years, but I've been a scientist for almost 20. And I invented a course there called T.A.L.K, which is all about the science and art of conversation. And at some point I realized not everyone's going to be able to take this course, and let's try and write it down in a book so that everybody can get their hands on it. Before this professional journey and this discovery of conversation, though, I was just a human being like everybody else. And I had a unique life in maybe one sense because I'm an identical twin. And my therapist has recently pointed out to me that it's maybe not surprising that I ended up studying human to human interaction, because it's almost like I'm trying to help other people find the tight-knit shared reality and closeness and mutual understanding that I have with my twin sister.
That's amazing. Thank you for answering our open-ended question. We start, I told Kevin before this, we're gonna get so meta with this. But we
Great.
start every episode with that question, what's your story? Because it's such a terrible question. And the point is, it's very broad, it's very grounding. We take this idea of storytelling as a pretty big image, right? Initially, when we started the show, it was about business. It was about business storytelling. It's about interviewing. It's like, what are the 5 things you can say, whatever. But very quickly on, we had a psychologist on the show, and we started talking about internal storytelling. And it was this idea, like conversation, storytelling is so broad. So we asked this question to kind of hear what people define storytelling is for themselves, and then we mine from that. So something I wanted to ask you about is because Kevin and I have debated this question a lot about starting so big and kind of skipping the small talk, and I know small talk's a very big part of your book. How would you give us advice right off the bat? How would you approach this? Can you start a conversation so intense, or what's the purpose of small talk?
That question that you asked is both, it's intense because it's personal, right? You're asking someone to tell you the story of themselves. So that's going to help you move away from small talk quite quickly if somebody is willing to give you a real vulnerable answer of like, well, I'm sure it's an interesting litmus test if you're asking that same question to all of your guests. Like, some people must answer that very, very differently. Many people would stick to professional stuff, or some people would share details of their life. I mean, it's a cool question. Technically, it is a small talk topic because it's a topic that you can ask anybody. It's not inherently personalized. In my course and in the book, we talk about this topic pyramid where there's 3 layers. And at the base layer are small talk topics, which are like any topic that you could ask anybody without any prior knowledge of who they are or what they like. The mistake is not small talk in general, but staying there too long. What I love about this question that you asked is that because it's inherently asking for personal information, it's going to help you climb the topic pyramid to the second level, which is tailored talk. And to get there, it requires you to get a little more personal, either through disclosure of like, let me tell you about myself, or by you telling me more about yourselves. Or it doesn't have to be about disclosure at all. It can also just be like, let's find topics that we all find interesting and exciting. So the question of like, is that a good question? You see people debating this online all the time. Like, what makes a good question? I'm a little bit less interested in what makes a good question and more interested in like, where does it take you? Where do you go next? You could start with a real crap question, but if you ask an amazing follow-up question, or you get excited about some nugget of something that it happens in their answer, then the conversation can get really good. The top tier of the pyramid, by the way, this topic pyramid, is deep talk. And I think not every conversation is headed to be deep, and not every conversation needs to be deep. But when you're there, it's just sort of, you should appreciate it and maybe have a little bit of recognition of like, hey, we just did a really amazing human thing together. And then to characterize this question that you asked, I wouldn't even say that it's intense so much as it is very broad. It's very abstract. And so you might see guests sort of flailing about how to answer it. Our minds need concreteness. And so one way to answer that question, and you heard me do this, is to say, I'm going to share a little bit about my professional background, but I'm also going to share something personal. And like literally framing my answer that way helps bring concreteness for me in my mind of like, well, how much should I share and what should I say here? Otherwise, you can kind of get lost in the abstractness of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think something interesting from your book, we loved your book, by the way, and we would get into it more. You take on elementary teachers by saying there are bad questions. This is a big debate Kevin and I actually recently had on a season 4 finale of like, what is something that's been ruined for you by doing this podcast? And I
Great
have
question.
a lower tolerance for bad questions.
Hmm.
How would you define a good and bad question?
I'm going to push you on this in a second, Gaurav, but I'm going to
Okay.
answer your question first. I think that there are lots of ways that questions can be bad. If they're hard to, if they're not fun or interesting for your partner to answer, that means it's not a good question. The goal is to get the ping-pongy back and forth exchange of ideas and energy going in a conversation. So if your question is hard for people to answer, or maybe even more importantly, if it's not fun or interesting to answer, you're going to lose that back and forth energy, which isn't necessarily about the question itself, but sometimes about the pattern of turn taking that comes after it. So often questions go wrong because they're too broad and abstract. And so it's hard to answer them. Other ways they can go wrong is like you're asking about a topic they're truly not interested in, or it's so far away from pursuing the goals that you actually want to achieve in the conversation that it's just like missed the mark. If you start asking me, like quizzing me about antique cars, I might tell you about my dad. My dad was a car guy. My brother's a car guy. I might tell you about what kind of cars I saw them working on. But I'm not that interested in antique cars. I don't have that much expertise. I'm not going to have that much interesting stuff to share. I will quickly turn the conversation back to you and be like, why did you ask that? What's your interest in cars? Why do you think that I would be interested in that? As a way to sort of salvage it. But at its core, that's probably not the best question to ask me because I don't have a ton of information or ideas to, or interest and energy to pursue that topic. So in the chapter on asking in the book, it's like less about asking bad questions and more about thinking about bad patterns of question asking that don't pursue the goals you're trying to achieve. And whether the goal is enjoyment or learning or persuasion or making a decision or brainstorm, whatever your goals are, you should be asking questions that move in that direction.
Yeah, and that's one thing we loved about your book, Talk Topics Asking, Levity, and Kindness. They're so intermingled, right? For example, like with asking questions, kindness really plays in because you talk a lot about this idea of how you're trying to serve the other person's goals in that experience,
Exactly.
in that interaction. So I think just like you were saying, I think it's such an important thing with asking questions. I pride myself on my questions. I ask a lot of them.
Gaurav, can I circle back to you? Can I ask you, when you guys had this debate of like what are what bad questions do you sort of protest? What do you think makes a bad question?
I think it's actually funny because I had trouble articulating it, but then once we read your book, it's like, oh, that's what I was saying. Unprepared questions bother me in particular, when I'm at like panel events, or I'm listening to a live Q&A podcast. When we take a lot of pride in our questions, and something we do when we write them, and we're trying a new format this season, but something we do when we write them is like, can someone else ask this on a different podcast? Then we shouldn't. Right. So one thing that bothers me when I listen to people, like at panels, especially when they ask a question, I'm like, why would you ask this person that question? That bothers me. That's kind of stuck with me.
Because it doesn't seem tailored to their expertise and their energy. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's it. And also it's kind of wasting everyone's time when you ask something that's completely out of nowhere, or it's like a pointed question where you have the answer already in your mind, at least you think you do.
Or like
And
the
it's just
gotcha
not
questions we also
gotcha
talked about.
questions.
Yeah.
I don't love yes or no questions, like things like that.
Can I say something about yes or no questions? There's so many different ways to slice and dice question types. Closed versus open is an easy way to understand questions. Like closed questions are either yes or no, or you provide an option set of different answers that you could give. They're not great as launch pads to send you in a new and exciting direction. They're not great for lots of information exchange. Actually, asking open-ended question tends to elicit more than twice the word count from your partner compared to closed questions. However, they do serve an important purpose in a conversation, right? Like if I need to very quickly check to make sure that we're understanding each other, or I need to get context very quickly of like, hey, have you seen the movie We Live in Time with Florence Pugh and Andrew Garfield? Like if I need very quickly to know something about you, then that kind of closed question helps us as a stepping stone to a bigger question, which is like, I was sobbing on the plane last night while I was watching that. What movie has made you cry recently? So that first closed question of like, have you seen this movie? Yeah, it's not like going to get you to talk a lot about, you're just going to say yes or no, but it's a stepping stone to something else that can get better. And I think that's the way I want people to start thinking about conversation is like, not necessarily is this question good or bad, but where does it lead? What comes after it? What purpose is it serving at that moment in the context of the whole conversation?
Something I see you doing and that you did in the book as well is like you set up these really clean frameworks. Like this leads to this moves up the pyramid, this is on this quadrant. I'm wondering how automatic has that become for you? Like, is it something where when you're in a conversation, you're thinking, oh, well, this is going to lead here or this is going to move me up the pyramid? Or has it become pretty automatic in the way you converse with people?
Oh, what a great question. It's very automatic for me. I've been studying this stuff and working on these frameworks for a long time, for a decade. So I thought a lot about it. I talk to people constantly. It's sort of become the lens that I have on the world. And so I'm constantly thinking about these frameworks. What I'm even more curious about is when I teach my MBA students these frameworks, how much is it becoming part of their lens on the world? Like, is it necessary to be the inventor of the frameworks, or is it enough to just read about them and try them and use them to also have it become part of your sort of repertoire? I think where I find it most useful, and my students have said similar things, is when you're in the midst of a conversation, it's not like I'm thinking actively a lot about, well, where are we on the conversational compass? Like, what goal am I pursuing right at this very instant? Or like, where have we been for most of the conversation on the topic pyramid? Like, how do we get to the top? But it does help me think about before a conversation begins, when I'm alone and I have more cognitive space to actually reflect about, like, why am I having this meeting? Or like, why am I meeting up with my friend for dinner? What is the main goal? Or what are my top priorities? Or what topics should I raise with them that will help me achieve what we actually want to achieve? Even if the goal is just like, I want this to be a riot. I want to make them laugh as much as possible. I want to like learn everything I can about their childhood, or whatever your goals are. Just think using these frameworks before the conversation and then sometimes after to reflect of like, well, did I achieve what I wanted to achieve? Where were we mostly on the pyramid? Did we linger too long in those small talk topics at the bottom? Is that why things felt a little stale? So I think these tools are very helpful as sort of reflection mechanisms to make sense out of the vast ocean of complexity that we confront during our conversations. But it's not like I'm thinking about them super actively while it's happening. There's too much else going on.
So how far would you go in terms of preparing for that conversation going in? I think especially it's harder for like a more, casual social conversation. For something like a more prepared interview, obviously we know it's good to, really sit down and write a full outline. But do you necessarily, or do you recommend doing that for, talking at a party, or on the scale between, that to like a 10-second brainstorm? What's the best way to prep for those more casual conversations?
I know this answer is like very dissatisfying, but it depends on so many things, including like who you are and what works for you. It's so funny. Let me give you an example. When I'm teaching a class session, it's an hour and a half, and it is like massively more complicated than it appears to oversee. At HBS, we use the case method or case discussion. So it's like a huge conversation that you're moderating between 90 different people. And your job is sort of like the topic leader. So in the beginning of my prep, I'm thinking about, well, like, what are all the spiciest and hardest questions or comments or things that could happen? Like, what are the nightmare scenarios? Let me attack those directly. Let me like craft out my thoughts of like, what would I say if somebody said, well, I think you're being racist, or like, well, I think they're showing gender bias and I'm really offended, or I think they're right. Like if something really makes you feel scared or nervous, whether it's in a job interview, anywhere, if you're whatever, high stake, if you're negotiating, if something makes you feel scared that it's going to come up, instead of turning away from it and ruminating and worrying and like not sleeping well, you can actually just like write it down and actually write down your answer, like, and then practice saying it out loud. So when I'm prepping for class, I go through this, especially when I'm teaching a case for the first time, I'll go through this very elaborate sort of thinking through what could we say? What are the most important takeaways here? What could where could this possibly go? But then I winnow it down. Like by the time we get to actual class, I'm only holding like 3 things in my head, like the 3 main topics. I want to start here about why did we get to a place where AI was invented? What are the best use cases for it? Where is it going to go in the future? That's like all I can hold in my head without having papers in front of me. And I don't want to hold papers while I'm teaching. So by the time we get to that moment, you've like winnowed it down. That's a lot of prep. That is like an impractical level of prep for a normal conversation where you're going to go and talk to your bestie or call your mom or whatever. So
I do a lot of prep work to call my mom, mostly emotional.
Yeah, do you? No, really? Do you, Gaurav? Do you think ahead about what to say?
Sometimes it's mostly emotional prep work. Just
Yeah, no, but that's right. But that's right. So even people are very averse to the idea of prepping before or even thinking ahead about conversations with like your mom or your best friend or your romantic partner, your kids. But even 30 seconds of thinking ahead of like, well, what should I be asking about? Like, what have they been up to in their life since we last talked? What are they struggling with? What could I check in with them about? What about my life would they be excited to hear about? Like just nudging yourself to reflect about that for just a few seconds before you're engaged in the chaos of live conversation turns out to be a really big deal. It makes conversation a lot better, less anxious. You're more likely to land on topics that are actually productive, much more enjoyable because you're not as panicked about what to talk about when things get stale. And you land on things that are mutually interesting to everybody. And it's not just for like huge teaching sessions or like the big work meeting where you need to design the agenda. It's also like, oh, I'm going to see my sister later. I should ask her how her 3rd child is doing because he had the flu last week.
Yeah. You know who I do this a lot with, and this is not at all what you're talking about, but what I do this a lot with is like when I have to like call someone, not like someone I know, like if it's like I have to call the bank or if I'm like going to UPS, am I prepping what I'm going to say? I don't know why.
Yeah.
I think I read somewhere it's like a Gen Z millennial thing because we don't like talking on the phone, but
I think you don't want to, those interactions are annoying. You don't want to forget the why you're there. They're very transactional. So like you're there for a very specific goal. You need to check on a package or you like need the customer service agent to like do a thing for you. So they're very goal directed. They're very transactional. Often they're annoying and can get hostile. You don't want to sit and wait on a phone call with a customer service person for 30 minutes and then not get what you called for. So making sure you have clarity of mission and that you're like emotionally prepared for this becoming a little bit confrontational, that's really important. Otherwise, those negative things are going to happen and then you're going to be pissed.
Yeah, and I think something important you said here is that this idea of it can only take a few seconds sometimes just to think about this. I think that was the biggest fear of it from like reading the book and being like, oh no, it's another thing I have to do now. I have to prep for everything. I have to start keeping lists because I get really obsessive over things. Like we just started Duolingo as like my book club group, and I'm really obsessive over it. And Kevin hasn't done any of it. It's really annoying actually. But I get really obsessed with things. So I'm like reading this, getting anxious, like, okay, now to be a good human, I have to keep these lists. But what you're saying is kind of like, it doesn't have to be that intense. It's more just like a little bit of forethought.
Yeah, even like 10, 15 seconds of thinking ahead of like, oh, I care about this person. So therefore I should think about what we need to talk about and what would be ideally most rewarding for them, right? Like we need to remind ourselves to not just talk about ourselves and our needs like all the time, because that's what human nature drives us to do. If we don't think ahead at all, you're just going to like vent about the most recent thing you're mad about, which is like probably not that fun or productive.
Sometimes
maybe. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. On the point of something we've been talking about right from the start is we're going very meta, obviously, with this conversation, us being podcast hosts. And this is me exposing myself now. I get so worried, and it just happened to me just now. I get so worried about what's up next. What's the next thing I should talk about? What's the next thing I should ask
Yeah.
to keep the conversation going to move forward? That I just stop listening to the other person.
Yeah.
What is wrong with me? How do we fix that?
Kevin, there's nothing wrong with you. I think that many people do that.
Mhm.
And sometimes it's because you're anxious and you want to be ready and you're like terrified of silence and you feel a sense of duty that it's like on you to guide where it goes next. So these are all like very virtuous, kind things that are like anxiety driven. For other people, sometimes it's like they're just truly disinterested in their partner and they're like, how do I get out of this? How do I take us somewhere else? So that's the sort of more selfish version of it. Here's the thing. Here's one idea that can make you maybe less anxious, less panicked, less ruminating about where you're going next.
Mm-hmm.
You can always ask a follow-up question. So like, even if you don't know where to go next, you don't actually need to say or know anything to be a great conversationalist. All you need to do is listen to what the other person is saying and then follow up on it. Say like, I hear you. What language are you learning on Duolingo? I'm dying to know, right? Like that doesn't require me to have thought ahead. It doesn't require me to have anything interesting or informed to say about learning languages. It's just me saying, I listen to you, I care about you, and I want to know more. And that is always going to make a conversation great. It can also relieve that pressure that you put on yourself in your mind of like, well, I have to, where are we going next? What's the panic? Where can we go? What should we do next? Which is like a pretty significant creativity task that your mind is trying to do at the same time that you need to be like paying attention and listening to your partner.
It's Italian, by the way. I lost the vote.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for letting me know. Abbondanza.
I lost the vote. I really wanted to do Latin, but everyone's like, it's a dead language. And I'm like, sounds so fun, but whatever. I lost
Is
the
Latin
vote.
even, okay, I'm going to sound so uninformed. Can you speak Latin? Is it just a written language?
I don't think anyone speaks it. You can.
Yeah. I guess people sing it if you're, study opera.
I just
things
know
like
that
that.
one line in The West Wing that Martin Sheen does in Latin. And I was like, gotta learn Latin.
Is that in the same episode? Is that in the Two Churches episode?
Yes, the two cathedrals.
Two cathedrals. Yeah. What an episode. Isn't that considered the best episode in like television history?
It's definitely up there. It's one of the best monologues I've ever seen.
Incredible.
It's the whole thing he does in Latin.
Yeah.
But I did want to ask a follow-up too, because I think about, it's interesting because I think about the other way more. Like Kevin's a big planner, and then I deal with a lot of anxiety. So I'm a big ruminator. How do you see this with your students where they kind of, high anxiety students kind of obsess over something they had said, right? How do you deal with that? Because I do it all the time. I see my sisters do it all the time where it's like obsessing over something innocuous you had said or not said, or in that moment that felt right, but now I'm like, oh, I should have done this. How do you deal with that in conversation?
I want to start by acknowledging that you both shared something very lovely and personal with me, that Kevin is ruminating about what comes next in conversation and Gaurav is ruminating about what's already happened. You are not alone. Most people feel both of these ways a lot of the time. And I hope that the book brings you some comfort to realize like conversation is very messy. The idea, I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to be perfect or like to always know what to say next, or like, oh God, there were so many awkward moments, or like, I shouldn't have said that thing, or I forgot to bring up this thing. Before, during, after, there's all kinds of rumination. But when you look under the hood of conversation, it's remarkably complex. It's a coordination game that actually is impossible to solve. So of course it's going to look less like a tidy movie script and more like a train wreck. And so like embracing that reality, learning that that's what's happening under the hood, I hope brings a lot of people comfort. Because even the best communicators, like, of course, we make tons of mistakes, and conversation gets really good when you realize that's normal. You find grace for yourself in those moments, and you're able to give grace to other people. Like, of course, they're going to ask the wrong question or a super abstract question, but if you're willing to roll with them with it and make it good, that's when conversation gets really good. That's when you can build trust. That's when you can break things and then repair them and all of the good things. Specifically about backward looking rumination, when you're like feel bad about how things went, there's some interesting data to suggest, number one, there's a liking gap. People think that other people like them less than they actually do, right?
Mhm.
So you should have confidence. On average, people like you more than you think after a conversation has ended. This has been shown robustly across one-on-one conversations and groups everywhere. We're under optimistic about how much people have liked us based on our interactions. There's also really nice research that you're better at talking than you think. So unlike in most behavioral science, it shows an above average effect where people rate themselves as better at tasks like driving and walking and reading compared to like everyone else in the world. You're like a little overconfident. The opposite is true for conversation. In fact, it's the only task that people show a below average effect, where you think you're worse than the average person because predictably tons of stuff goes wrong and you feel like it's your fault as a conversation unfolds. So both of those things should bring everyone comfort. It's like people like you more than you think. You're already doing a better job than you think you're doing. There's always going to be problems. And the key is sort of embracing the messiness of it, working to always repair and work towards a nice shared reality, shared understanding, and just like persisting, right? Like continuing to do your best. The other thing that's like hard to accept as a chronic ruminator, you don't know what the other person thought about the interaction. So like the moment that you were like, oh, I can't believe I said that thing, or like, oh no, I forgot to ask this so important question, they're going to be so mad at me. No, they're not. They don't know what you could have asked and didn't ask. Or like if you ask the other person what was the most awkward moment in the conversation, it is almost with 100% certainty going to be something other than the moment that you're ruminating about. Conversation is a very wicked feedback environment where you can't learn how things would have gone that you didn't choose to say and do. And even the things you did choose to say and do, people don't give you feedback of like, oh, I loved that joke, or like, I love that you're smiling all the time, or I really hate that you asked that question at the beginning. Like we're just not unable to give continuous feedback like that to each other. So we often like ruminate about the wrong things.
See, and this is really where we get into storytelling, right? It's this idea that internal storytelling is a big part of the show because these are the stories we're telling ourselves, right? Oh, they don't like me. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. Oh, that was a bad joke. Oh, I forgot his birthday. Right? These are the stories you're telling yourself that's competing with the conversation game.
Well, and it holds you back, just like Kevin was saying, it holds you back from being able to really pay attention to the other person and really figure out what they need. Because your brain is so busy ruminating and feeling bad and focusing on yourself and all of your, deficiencies, when really this intense focus on the other person is necessary and ideal for good conversation.
Yeah, it's that idea of also like it's not always about you. And which is a tenet to so many different things when it comes to just how we think stories we tell ourselves. And I also remember one really interesting story that stuck with me from the kindness section was you getting a question from one of your EMBA students about, whether this lecture was going to be worth his time.
Yeah.
And turns out he didn't necessarily come with a malicious intent with that question. It was more relevant to his personal condition at the time. And I thought that was just a really interesting, powerful story.
And I was bringing my own frame to that moment, right? I was very early in my faculty career. It was, I think, the first session I had ever taught in an executive education classroom. I was like 27, a woman, in this room full of international male students who are probably, between 50 and 60. I know that I'm not what they're expecting to see leading a class like this. I'm bringing in all this fear and rumination and anxiety about imposter syndrome and all of this stuff. So when someone comes up and says to me, is it worth my time to stay here? my assumption is like, oh, like he thinks it's going to be bad. It's like confirming my fear, the fear that I brought into the room. When in fact, it had nothing to do with me. It had nothing to do with my gender and my experience or what the quality of the class. It turns out the guy was like very ill and he had to choose sessions to attend and not attend. He probably could have explained that better in the moment, right? Conversation's a two-way street, but still, imagine if I had been like, how dare you? How dare you come in here and think that you're not going to like this session? I think you're biased. I'm so angry, right? That would have been highly inappropriate. It would have been ruined my mindset for the rest of the class. And really made me like my job less, probably. So there are all of these sort of downstream consequences of reacting in a sort of defensive way. And it was such a poignant reminder that you just don't know. It's impossible to know what's in other people's minds until you ask them directly.
I mean, I think this is such an important part of kindness too in your book and in life. Your book is so oriented on the kind thing to do in conversation is help the other person, help them achieve their goals, see how you can provide value. But it's also being kind to yourself, in these conversations in your own mind and being like, I'm doing my best too. We're all just doing our best.
Yeah. If I could go back in time to that moment, I wish I could say like, Alison, you're doing great. Like you don't need to bring your anxiety to these people. Just do your best. Like it's amazing that you're here and you're doing a good job. And I wish I could say that to everybody, right? Like that's so that it would help reduce their anxiety and their defensiveness that you bring to every conversation. That can really derail things when these little minor hiccups and we confront sort of difficult moments.
Yeah, I'm very glad you're adding more context to that story, and also got me curious because I just turned 27. Graham and I were around the same age as well.
As soon as he said 27, I'm like, he's going to ask about it.
Yes. So, yeah, I mean, I think a huge part of being a good conversationalist is also kind of leveling that playing field in your mind, making sure, you or the other person feel like you're worthy going into that conversation. Do you still remember how you overcame that, having to teach those lectures to students that are obviously way older and more professionally experienced? How do you level that playing field for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, being low status is a prison. I mean, it's really, really hard. So much of my career also, I have felt very low status. I know it sounds ridiculous coming from like a Harvard professor who's going to turn 40 next month, but even still, I find myself in many rooms where I'm the youngest, I'm the most female, and other rooms where I'm not, where it's very clear that I'm the one leading the meeting or leading, highest status in the room now. But I very vividly remember being 27 and mostly finding yourselves in groups or in conversations where you're the low man on the totem pole. And so every group has an inherent status hierarchy. And when you find yourself in a lower status position, and often it correlates with age or time that you've been at an organization, probably shouldn't. It's just the way it is. It's not fair. But when you find yourself in that position, there's so many things that make it hard. There's a narrower array of options of things that you could say that are going to be viewed as like valuable or appropriate. If you stay quiet, the group's not going to learn from you and it will be hard for you to earn status. If you speak a lot, people are going to be like, well, that doesn't seem appropriate for someone who's in a low status position, or like, do they actually have value to add to this conversation on something that they don't have a lot of expertise yet? So it's really this double bind that ends up pushing low status people to the margins. And I think it's why so many of us feel like we're like hemming and hawing or writhing in quietude during group conversations. The responsibility to confront that lies with everybody, right? It lies largely with people who are in higher status positions to, number one, get out of the way, like stop talking all the time, give people space and make them feel safe and empowered to actually talk when they have valuable things to add. but there's also the sense of like, it's not just about developing psychological safety during that one conversation. That's an effort that's happening all the time across so many one-on-ones and group conversations. And that's a leader's job. And many leaders are not great at that. But the responsibility can also fall. We have power as low status people too, to reflect about like, well, where do I have value to add? If I don't feel comfortable speaking in the group, are there people I can talk to one-on-one before the meeting or after the meeting where I can exert some or add some value, bring some ideas, ask interesting questions? During the meeting, often people who are in low status positions are in a good position to ask questions or sort of steer topics in a way of like, oh, I love that we're talking about this. Let's not forget that we're here to make a decision, right? Like or let's not forget that we're here to brainstorm as many ideas as possible. So let's move to the next one. Let's start ideating again. So it often, because you're sitting there more quietly than others, it puts you in a good position to sort of think about what should we be doing right now and how can I help us stay on mission. That doesn't require almost any expertise, by the way. It just requires good listening, paying attention to where the conversation is going, and being really honest with yourself of like, where can I add value?
I think this is where the co-narration topic you talk about comes into such an important play. This idea that conversation is collaborative storytelling. And it's funny how different stories will play in your mind in different environments. You have a lot of consistent stories, consistent anxieties. I have a ton, but in different environments, like I deal with different things. It's because conversations I've had with a manager or a team or an org have dictated the stories I'm telling myself. So I think the co-narration aspect that you're talking about here a little bit is so important.
Yeah, I just worked with a group of entrepreneurs at this startup boot camp, and we did a workshop on storytelling. I mean, so much of I think how people think of entrepreneurship is about
Mhm.
storytelling, telling the story of your company, pitching your idea to people. But the point of my workshop was, look, life is not a sequence of pitches. It's not you don't go through life as a stream of speeches that you're making to into the ether. Life is a series of conversations, and conversation is not one way. Storytelling is not one way. It is information being shared with an active other human mind or many minds, and the interaction, their engagement, whether they're asking questions and reacting and giving you energy, whether you're asking them questions or giving them energy, is so important in telling stories in the way that we experience life. So in this workshop, here's what I had them do. I was like, take 2 minutes. I want you to do this exercise called never ending follow-ups, where one person is literally asking a question every time they talk. I would start with a question. I don't know, like, what did you have for breakfast? You tell me. And then I'm like, well, what do you always have that for breakfast? Or like, what's your favorite? What's your healthiest breakfast? And then you kind of go from there. It sounds very extreme, but in the experience of it, you realize, oh, this is how you escape small talk. This is, you ask questions, it moves you in a new direction. Things get personal. You learn a ton of information about somebody very quickly. So while the entrepreneurs are doing this never ending question asking exercise, they are learning so much about their partner. And I forbid them from making it about themselves. I forbid them from like pitching their story to this person. It is really, for those 2 minutes, focus on the other person. Then part 2, now you've got 30 seconds to tell your story to this person and get them to do even one useful thing for your company. You're in a way, way better position to do that 30-second pitch, to tell that 30-second story, because you devoted those 2 minutes to actually learning about this person and what they need, what they care about, what they're excited about, what's going on in their life. You've learned about their perspective. So now you can frame your story so that it is actually and authentically interesting to them.
I love that idea you just brought up of, storytelling not being one way. I think
Mhm.
with our show, at least for me, sometimes we focus so much on like the telling part of the story, right? How you as the one who has the story to tell is going to deliver that to your audience. But then really, how does the other party come into play. They also have a role in the telling of that story. They're not necessarily just the recipient of that. So it does come down to like the fundamental principle of understanding your audience in storytelling communication. But I love this kind of reframing of our think of how to tell a story.
And it's not just understanding your audience. It's like you proactively need to seek out, learn about your audience, right? Like that conversation opens that opportunity for you to ask, like, what is in your mind? What do you care about? Tell me everything, so that I can come to a place of understanding about your mind, so that I can tell you about my perspective in a way that's actually interesting to you. And we can also flip the perspective. I think probably a lot of your content here, and I think a lot of people think of it this way, is like, what am I saying when I'm telling a story? But when you're a listener and somebody is giving you their story, you're receiving information from somebody else, you can also actively exert some control and active behaviors that help make the story more interesting and more relevant for you, for this person. You can be a much more sort of proactive sounding board for someone else's story, so that it truly comes to be co-narrated in a much more exciting and productive way.
I wanted to ask, because I think we've talked about this a little bit on the show, and this idea of how social media has made that worse, right? How we live in these bubbles and these like perfect image stories, and we think everyone's living their best lives at all times, and it's kind of glued us to our phone. How have you seen conversations change as like the rise of social media, the rise of technology, when we're spending more time in elevators with our AirPods in?
So people are already very self-centered. So 60% of what people say in conversation is focused on their own perspective, on themselves. It just feels good to talk about yourself. It's what you know. It feels great. It's akin to like eating chocolate or sometimes having sex. Like talking about yourself feels great. Same pleasure centers of the brain. That's even more true on social media, where like 85% of what people post is about themselves and about their own perspective. So as often social media amplifies the sort of self-centered tendencies that people already have in conversation. And as much as we'd like to believe that stuff that's happening online is sort of mimics conversation in a way, it's not conversation. It is a far cry from live back and forth dialogue with a real living, breathing person sitting right there. And that causes all kinds of challenges and problems for how fun and engaging and productive and humanizing an interaction can actually be. So that's sort of one sort of obvious thing about what social media does to us as communicators. What I've been thinking about recently, though, is a little bit sort of tangential, which is when you go through your life now, you are constantly you're moving from like texting your friend on your phone to writing an email to now, then you hop on a Zoom call. Oh, somebody's texting me while we're on the Zoom call. If we all looked at our phones right now, I've missed 9 texts. I don't know about you. And a phone call, actually. You then turn to somebody in real life and talk face to face. Meanwhile, you know that there are texts and emails and phone calls coming in, or you're like anxious about how many likes you're getting on your social media account. So our brains are being asked to do this very complicated toggling, attentional toggling across all kinds of devices and modes of communication. I don't think scientists yet know what that's doing to our brains. Like, what's good about it? How is this affecting our mental health? How is it affecting our ability to connect? In my class, I asked my students to do a communication audit where they record every incoming and outgoing message that they receive in their life across all modes of communication. So phone, text, email, face-to-face, Zoom, social media, for a period of like 20 minutes in your life. So you can imagine this, right? And you realize, oh my God, like all of these threads and these topics and these jokes and these people are so overlapping and so braided and coming in and going out all the time. Which is on one hand an amazing opportunity. You can like really be connected to many more people at once than ever before in human history. But I think the sort of downside risk of it is like, what feels real? Who are we really connecting with? If I look back on those 20 minutes, what do I remember? What made me feel any sort of real human emotion or sense of connection? And usually, often the answer is only the people that you talk to face, or maybe talk to on the phone. Zoom's great, but it's certainly not the same sort of psychological and emotional richness of if we were actually sitting together here in my hotel room, you know? And so I think these questions of like, what is real? What is more transactional, and how do we leverage this new world that we're living in? We hear a lot of rhetoric about how dangerous it is for children, which is for sure true. But it's also a challenge that we as adults confront. And I don't think we quite have an understanding yet of how it's affecting our brains.
I think one of the things I struggle with storytelling and conversation is that, we're constantly seeing the media we're seeing is so tailored. Like whether it's a television show where everything's scripted, or it's social media where everything's carefully analyzed, and now emails that are being ran through AI edits. We're getting used to this very perfect way of communicating that we forget communication's messy. We forget that these are just stories we're telling ourselves. And it's important to remind ourselves we're messy. Humans are messy.
I hope one of the themes that comes out in the book is, yes, the messiness, but also humans are different than machines. So in an algorithm on social media, it's going to try and figure out what you need, but the algorithm itself doesn't have needs, right? Like you're not reciprocally thinking about, well, what does it need? Or if you're on a chatbot or with an AI or with an LLM or whatever, its whole job and why it feels good and is so promising and so helpful is because it is only there to serve your needs. If you need to brainstorm ideas, it's going to really help you do that. If you need companionship, it can really help you with that. If you need to make a decision, it can help you with that. That's not what human to human interaction is. When humans interact with each other, both people have needs. And we're constantly trying to coordinate and figure out like what does the other person need, and am I giving them anything of what they need? Am I bringing any value to them? Are they bringing value to me? When you're interacting with like an AI chatbot, we're not thinking about its needs at all because it doesn't have needs. It doesn't have sincere desires. And that's a very, very important distinction.
As we start to wrap things up, because cognitive time, I wanted to ask you kind of a question you asked us earlier. You asked us, has doing this podcast made us better storytellers? So I want to ask you, has writing this book made you a better conversationalist, even though X decade and a half, whatever, of teaching this? Have you become better at conversations through this book?
What a nice question. I think two things. One is that it's made me less anxious about conversation before they happen. I almost never feel anxious anymore, even in really high stakes situations. Really, like I just feel more confident and excited to connect with people because I know that it's going to be messy and we're going to like do weird stuff, and that's okay. It's all great. And there's like no hard thing that they could ask me or say that will make me mad and we're going to yell at each other, right? Like there's just the threats that I think a lot of us worry about kind of melt away when you have a better understanding of how it all works. And then the second piece I think is I feel more grateful. I feel more grateful for people's time. I feel more grateful for when anything goes well. Like if you ask even one good question, you laugh together a couple times when you're together. If you feel a sense of connection with anyone at any point because you were able to talk to them and find any sort of magical moment, that's such a huge win. And a lot of people aren't finding those wins. Like 30% of adults have fewer than 2 friends now. So 2/3 of adults report feeling lonely every day. And so I think studying this stuff and learning all of these nitty-gritty details about how conversation works just makes me feel truly very grateful in the moments when it goes right.
Thank you so much for such a great conversation. And to be mindful of the precious time, our closing segment is called Suspenders. This is where we ask you a fun, random question that can really be about anything. And feel free to give us any answer you feel like. Question of the day is, what has excited you recently?
Allison,
It's my.
I
Go
stole this
ahead. Go.
question. I stole this question from you.
I was gonna say that's my
podcast.
favorite. That's my favorite question. What's exciting me? I have one of the biggest weeks of my life coming up. I get to go and talk about my book that I worked on for 15 years. I get to go talk about it with so many hundreds of people and the people that I love. And I'm so hopeful and excited that it lands with people and that it's helpful to them in their lives. And I'm really excited to see what comes next, right? A book isn't, you don't just write a book for a book. You write a book so that it leads to even more exciting and wonderful things. And so I'm really excited to see what's coming next for Talk and for me.
We loved it. Highly recommend anyone listen to it or read it. It's a great book. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much, guys. It's been
Thank
such
you,
a
Allison.
delight. You keep going. You're fabulous.
Welcome back to Top Hat. This is the part of the episode where we dissect and analyze some of the cool and epic things we got from this week's expert storyteller. And Kev, it's our first Top Hat of the new season, and you and I both read this book. We both loved this book. We had this amazing conversation. So let's do something a little different for our Top Hat. Why don't we break down our key lessons from this episode into the 4 categories that Alison talks about in the book? The acronym TALK: topics, asking, levity, and kindness.
Yeah, those are the 4 letters that is at the core of Alison's class, the book, and really, I think there's so much to dig into each of those letters. But something that really inspired my thinking from the first letter, topics, is really how important it is to prepare for any kind of conversations going into it, even for like a casual social conversations. There's value in just having a quick brainstorm beforehand about your intention coming into it. Believe it or not, it doesn't make you sound scripted when you prepare. It actually makes the conversation a lot better, and you'll feel a lot better going in and coming out of the conversation because you prepared beforehand.
I think something really crucial she talked about this element of storytelling is that just because you prep those stories, just because you prep those topics, doesn't mean you have to talk about them. It might just open up your mind to have things just in case you get stuck, or just have you thinking about the conversation a little bit more in depth before you go in. And with storytelling, that's so important, right? Thinking about the audience.
Yeah, and I think something that didn't make it into the 4 letters, but is an important rule, is actually the other way around, is listening. I spend so much time thinking about what I want to say next to drive the conversation forward that I forget to listen, forget to really actually pay attention to what the other person is actually saying, that I just zone out or I just fall out of the loop. Where really it's really important to actually listen, because it is through listening that you'll be able to know what to say next, that you can ask a follow-up question that'll keep the conversation going, and show that you're paying attention, that you're being curious.
And I mean, that goes right into the next one, asking, right? Anytime you're trying to create something for the audience, anytime you're trying to engage them, ask them questions, figure out what their problem is, what their need is, and how you can tell a story or create something to solve it, right? Or just ask them to engage them, to bring them into the story. Like stand-up comics do this really well with audience work, where they're asking them questions, and it's still their style of comedy. They're still the storyteller, but by asking them questions, you're bringing them in. So I think this was a crucial part, is that you can never ask too many questions, apparently. According to Alison's work, it's really hard to ask too many questions, and often people aren't asking enough. And to be an effective storyteller, to understand your audience, the most important thing you can do is to ask questions.
L for levity. I don't know, honestly. I think that was one of the sections where I read it, and I'm like, how does one be funny? How do you bring levity into a conversation? It's not one of those things where you can follow a rule book and be naturally funny, you know?
Levity to me ties to entertaining, right? It doesn't matter what the conversation is, it doesn't matter what it's for. It could be at work, it can be a tough conversation. And yes, there are definitely, definitely times where levity is not appropriate, but more than you think, levity is. You know, if you're having a tough conversation with someone and you want them to feel more supported, instead of just kind of hammering them, like, and making them feel more anxious and creating a culture and environment that can be really stressful and hard to deal with, inject some levity and make your joke, make them feel more comfortable because you want to grow and work with them. This was actually one of the sections I felt most comfortable with at Kev, because one, you know, I genuinely try to bring levity into situations, whether it's like a fun little
Yep.
email sign off or like in messages or what have you. Levity is really important to me, and I think it comes kind of natural to me. But I think one other thing is I also read a kind of a sister book to this, Humor Seriously by Jennifer Acker and Naomi Baganos. You can always be a little bit more entertaining. You can always be a little bit funnier, right? Bringing happiness and optimism and levity to situations can make you a better leader and a more memorable person in general. Try to bring entertaining levity to it and push yourself to be a little bit more fun, you know? And that kind of brings us to the next one. K for kindness. Super important when you bring levity that you're doing it to make the other one feel more comfortable. Super important when you're prepping questions or prepping topics that you're trying to engage the other person. Super important when you're asking questions, you're genuinely interested. Because in all of those sections, if you don't bring kindness, you don't think of the other person, it's all going to feel stilted. The topics are going to feel superficial. Levity is going to feel corporate.
And this is where the internal storytelling
Mhm.
that we spend a lot of time talking about becomes crucial, because showing kindness means sometimes not making false assumptions or not making assumptions at all about the person you're talking to. We went through a powerful example with Allison that sometimes you don't know what your conversation partner is going through. And also kindness to show yourself, because the story you tell yourself about yourself can affect your status, your position in a conversation. A negative self talk narrative might put yourself in a position where you don't feel like you're worthy of going into this conversation. And that might unnecessarily direct you away from having a great time, from maximizing the value you can get going into a conversation. Tell better stories to yourself, about yourself, and be kind to yourself. Be kind to your conversation partner as well.
That is the season 5 premiere of the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. Go out and get Allison's book, think about the talk maxims, and ask yourself, how can I be a better storyteller in my everyday communication? And how does better storytelling make me better overall?
If you like the show, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment wherever you listen. Let us know what you're thinking, how you want to see us get better. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at LSPT Pod, LinkedIn, Linen Suit and Plastic Tie. Thanks again, Allison, for bringing your wonderful story and insights to our show, and we will see you next time.
Thank you. You're doing great. We'll see you next time.
Linen suit, plastic tie. Linen suit, plastic tie.